I was born into a story that wasn't mine. A script written by others, men in robes, women with hollow smiles, all repeating the same verses over and over like a spell meant to erase who we were. In our small Iranian town, the cult didn't look like one. It looked like family, like discipline, like sacred devotion. My mother said obedience was holy. My father nodded in silence. And I learned to pray before I learned to think. They taught us that questions were sins. That doubt was evil. That the outside world was corrupt. They wrapped our thoughts in veils and shame. And when something felt wrong, they told us the devil was tempting us. So we stayed quiet. I stayed quiet. Even when I saw the bruises on my friend Niloufar's wrists. Even when I felt the cold hand of a teacher where it should never have been. There was no room for protest. No space for escape. Just white walls, memorized chants, and a silence that settled in our bones like dust. We smiled for visitors. We recited the rules. We behaved. But inside, something in me screamed. My name is Layla Sahar. And this is the story I never thought I would be allowed to tell. When I turned 13, they gave me a headscarf and a list of marriageable virtues. No boyfriends. No ambition. No loud opinions. Just purity and piety. But one night, I heard my brother crying in the next room. And I knew, the sickness was everywhere. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just Niloufar. We were all casualties in a war no one admitted existed. I started writing in secret. Just a sentence here, a question there. Why does God allow this? Why do we obey men who harm us? I tore out the pages and buried them behind our courtyard tree. I felt guilty for thinking. But I kept thinking. That guilt was my first rebellion. The final push came the night they punished my cousin for looking sinful. She was 15. They cut her hair off and locked her in a prayer room. I heard her sobbing through the walls. That night, I stopped praying. I started watching instead. Watching how they lied. How they used God like a weapon. When I left for university at 19, I lied to get out. Said I wanted to study theology. Said I wanted to become a better servant. But really, I wanted answers. And freedom. They say university opens your mind. For me, it reopened wounds I didn't know I had buried. When I left Iran at 19, under the guise of studying abroad, I carried more than just a suitcase. I carried silence. A heavy, obedient silence. The kind that's been trained into you with scripture and shame. I chose journalism because it felt like the farthest thing from what I was taught. In my community, speaking out, especially as a woman, was a sin. In journalism, your entire purpose is to speak. To question. To investigate. I didn't know if I was brave enough to do that, but I knew I had to try. If I could just tell someone else's story, maybe I could slowly, secretly, learn to tell my own. At first, I was terrified. Every time a professor called on me, my voice trembled. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because for so long, I had been taught that answering was dangerous. Asking questions? Even worse. My classmates were bold, opinionated, curious. They debated politics and human rights over coffee. I sat quietly, writing everything down, trying to understand how freedom worked. But the silence was breaking. I started writing essays that felt more like confessions. I wrote about censorship, about repression, about the way stories are controlled by those in power. I never mentioned my past directly, but it bled through the margins. One professor pulled me aside and said, "You write like you've lived 10 lives." I smiled, but didn't correct him. He was wrong. I had lived one life, but I'd been forced to live it in hiding. The first time I shared part of my story, it wasn't on purpose. We were doing a mock interview in class, and the question was, why did you choose journalism? My answer came before I could stop it, because silence almost killed me. There was a pause in the room. I remember someone blinking too hard, trying not to cry. I remember feeling light. As if a chain had just slipped off my chest. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep quiet anymore. Not just for me, but for the other girls I left behind. For the ones still sitting in prayer halls, too scared to speak. For the ones who were told they were impure, unworthy, unimportant. University didn't save me. It challenged me. It forced me to confront every lie I had been fed. But most importantly, it gave me the tools to rebuild my voice. To unlearn the fear. To understand that storytelling isn't just art, it's rebellion. And I was ready to rebel. The first time I pressed record, my hands were shaking. It was a small handheld camera, borrowed from the university equipment room, still warm from the previous student's grip. I had no crew, no budget, no real plan. Just a battered notebook filled with scribbled memories and a voice that wouldn't stay buried anymore. I didn't start with the big moments. I couldn't. They were too raw, too dangerous. Instead, I filmed silence. Empty prayer halls, long hallways where girls used to line up in white veils, the echo of footsteps. I recorded my own hands reaching for doorknobs I once feared to open. I stood outside buildings that still bore the name of the cult that raised me. They'd changed the branding, softened the symbols, replaced the slogans, but I recognized the bones beneath the new paint. It felt like chasing ghosts. But they were real. They had names. Faces. Power. I started interviewing others. Quietly. Carefully. Girls like me, scattered across cities, countries, time zones. Some had escaped years before I did. Some were still in, sending coded messages through encrypted apps. We talked about childhood like it was a crime scene. Every story mirrored mine in uncanny ways. The fear of men in robes, the punishments masked as purification, the sermons that confused God with control. One girl, I'll call her Lala, told me how she was locked in a cellar for 3 days for asking why boys were allowed to eat meat while girls fasted. Another, Mina, had been forced into a sham marriage at 14 with a man who quoted scripture while hurting her. We cried together. Then we hit record again. Because truth needs evidence. I didn't know how to edit. I didn't know how to protect sources. But I learned. Fast. I taught myself late at night, cutting, splicing, blurring faces, warping voices. Each frame was a wound laid bare. Each second was a defiance. I was terrified, but I was alive in a way I had never felt before. The documentary took a year to finish. I called it Under the Veil. Not because it was about religion, but because it was about what they hid behind religion. Control. Abuse. Silence. I submitted it to an independent film festival under a pseudonym. I expected rejection, or worse, backlash. What I got was a standing ovation. People came up to me after the screening, in tears. Strangers whispered, that was my story too. Survivors thanked me. Activists handed me their cards. Producers asked what I was working on next. I smiled and said, healing. But the most important feedback came in a single anonymous message. You told the truth. You said what we couldn't. Thank you for setting us free. I printed that message and taped it above my desk. Because that was the moment I realized. I wasn't just making a film. I was building a reckoning. They say truth sets you free. What they don't say is that sometimes, it tries to burn you alive on its way out. 2 weeks after Under the Veil premiered, the backlash began. It started small. A vague email from someone claiming to be from my past, warning me to take the film down. Then a sudden flood of messages on social media, some calling me brave, others calling me a liar, a traitor, a disgrace to my culture. My face began circulating in private religious forums, alongside photoshopped images and crude slurs. Some accused me of staging the entire thing. Others demanded I release the names of the abusers, as if the burden of justice was mine to carry alone. The worst came in the form of a lawsuit, filed by a prominent member of the cult, now rebranded as the leader of a charity organization. They accused me of defamation, of inciting hatred, of endangering community harmony. I sat in a courtroom, flanked by lawyers who looked at me like I was poison, while a man I once called uncle calmly denied every story I had gathered. He looked me in the eye and said, "She's mentally unstable. She's exaggerating. We raised her with love." Love. That word made my stomach twist. My lawyer whispered to remain calm. I didn't flinch. I had built my voice from ashes. I wasn't going to let them burn it again. But the pressure. It was real. Sponsors dropped me. A fellowship I had applied for vanished without explanation. Even some professors at my university advised me to distance myself from controversy. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a mistake. If telling the truth had cost me more than I could afford. Then came the turning point. A major news outlet picked up the story. Not just the documentary, but the attempted silencing of it. They interviewed survivors who had watched the film, scholars who had studied cult behavior, and legal experts who called the lawsuit an intimidation tactic. Suddenly, I wasn't just a target, I was a symbol. Messages flooded in again, but this time they were different. I watched it with my mother. We both cried. My sister is still trapped. I'm going to get her out. I showed this to my class. They didn't know what spiritual abuse looked like until now. And then, one day, I received a voice message, from a girl, no older than 15, whispering from what sounded like a bathroom stall. "I saw your film on someone's phone. I didn't know anyone else felt the way I do. I'm going to try to leave. Thank you." I played that message every morning for weeks. The lawsuit was eventually dropped. Quietly. No apology. No acknowledgement. But they knew they had lost something. They could no longer operate in the dark. Eyes were on them now. I had survived the fire. I had protected my girls. I had defended my truth. But I also learned. Telling your story is only the beginning. Standing by it, that's the revolution. After the flames died down, I found myself standing in a strange kind of silence. Not the suffocating silence I had grown up with, the silence of secrets, of swallowed pain, but a new one. A quiet that comes after a storm, when you're left with nothing but truth and breath. I didn't know what to do with this stillness. For the first time in my life, no one was shouting over me. I had spoken. The world had listened. And yet, I still felt unfinished. One evening, as I was cleaning out my editing folders, I came across a raw clip I had forgotten. It was a shot of me, accidentally filmed, testing the microphone before an interview. I wasn't ready, my hair was messy, and I looked tired. But what struck me wasn't how I looked. It was how I was sitting. I was hunched. Curled in on myself like I still expected someone to tell me to be smaller, quieter, less. I stared at that frame for a long time. That woman, that version of me, was gone. She had filmed a revolution. She had carried voices through fire. She had survived a childhood cult, fought off lawsuits, turned trauma into art. Why was she still shrinking? So I filmed something new. No edits. No survivors. No exposé. Just me. Facing the camera. Saying everything I had never said out loud. I spoke of my mother, who still won't watch the documentary. I spoke of the guilt I carry. Leaving girls behind, even though I know I had no choice. I spoke of the nightmares, the insomnia, the day I vomited from panic after seeing a man who wore the same robes as my abuser. I spoke of healing, not as a final act, but as a fight I recommit to every morning. And then, I asked a question. What would you say if no one could silence you? That video went viral. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't polished. But it struck something raw and real. People responded with their own videos, women in hijabs, men in tears, queer teens, grandmothers, former cult members, strangers from every continent. They looked into their cameras and answered. They found their mirrors. They found their mic. And I realized something I hadn't understood before. The power wasn't just in telling my story. It was in unlocking theirs. I started a platform. A digital sanctuary where survivors could upload their testimonies safely, anonymously or not. We called it Echolight. It wasn't just a site. It was a movement. We offered legal resources, therapy grants, workshops on storytelling and digital safety. For the first time, victims weren't begging to be believed. They were curating their own narratives. And I kept filming. Not because I needed revenge anymore, but because I needed to remember that silence is a choice I will never make again. My name is Soraya. I am not a whisper. I am a witness. I used to believe that forgiveness was surrender. That to forgive meant to excuse. To minimize. To erase. And how could I ever forgive the people who stole my childhood? The man who pressed holy words into my skin like branding. The women who watched and said nothing. The elder who told me pain was purification. How could I forgive people who had never once said sorry? But healing is a strange road. It doesn't go straight. It loops back. It twists. It drags you through memories you thought you buried. And it dares you, to let go of weight you've grown used to carrying. One night, after a long shoot for Echolight, I found myself alone on the rooftop of our small office space. Tehran shimmered below me, dark and restless. I sat cross-legged, scrolling through submissions from survivors. One story stopped me cold. A woman, much older than me, who had once been a teacher in the very sect that abused me. She confessed to turning a blind eye. She wrote, "I was too afraid. But I see now what I allowed to happen." I froze. I reread it 5 times. She hadn't used her name. But I recognized her voice. For a moment, the rage surged back. I saw her standing in the doorway, watching me cry, doing nothing. I remembered her hand on my back, guiding me into a prayer room like a lamb to slaughter. My fists clenched. My breath caught. But then something unexpected happened. I cried. Not with anger. But with relief. Because for the first time in 30 years, someone had said it happened. Someone on the other side had broken their silence too. That's when I realized, forgiveness isn't for them. It's for me. Forgiveness doesn't mean I let them back into my life. It doesn't mean I forget. It doesn't mean justice isn't pursued. It just means I no longer let them live rent-free in my soul. So I wrote her back. I didn't say, "It's okay." I said, "Thank you for seeing me. I hope you're ready to see yourself now, too." After that, I began a new series for Echolight, called Bridges. Not everyone was ready for it. Some called me naive. Others said it was dangerous to give abusers space to speak. But that wasn't what Bridges was for. It was a place for the complicit to confront what they'd ignored. It wasn't forgiveness I was offering, it was reckoning. Honest, filmed, documented reckoning. And in that space, something powerful emerged. Some survivors began healing not from justice, but from acknowledgement. From hearing, "Finally, I did this to you. And I was wrong. I still don't forgive everyone. Some don't deserve it. Some never will. But I forgive myself for believing I was powerless. I forgive the girl I was, who didn't run, who didn't scream, who obeyed because she thought it was holy. She was just trying to survive. Now I live for her." I found the photograph in a storage box, wrapped in a disintegrating ribbon that smelled faintly of mold and incense. It was the only picture I had of myself as a child. 8 years old. Thin. Dark eyes too large for my face. Standing beside the prophet's wife, cloaked in white, who held my shoulders as though I might fly away. I wasn't smiling. My lips were closed in that tight line of children who've been told they are lucky but don't feel it. For years, I hated that photo. I buried it beneath piles of notebooks. I couldn't look at that little girl. I blamed her. I blamed her for staying. For not screaming. For trusting. But as Echo Light grew, we began receiving more and more submissions from survivors who didn't have any proof, only memories, sometimes fractured, sometimes blurred. And one day, in an interview, a young woman whispered to me, "I just wish someone had taken a picture, so I knew I hadn't imagined it." That night, I pulled out the photo. For the first time in decades, I placed it on my desk and really looked at it. And I saw her. I didn't see weakness. I saw a child trained to survive in silence. I saw fear, yes, but also defiance, quiet and burning beneath the surface. I saw a girl standing in the storm of control, trying to stand upright. I started crying. But not like before. These tears came from somewhere deeper, somewhere clean. That's when I decided to make the photo public. We built an exhibition in collaboration with other survivors. We were here. Each person contributed one artifact from their childhood, a photo, a journal entry, a uniform, a broken pendant. It was part museum, part memorial, part rebellion. The girl in the photo became our symbol. I didn't caption it. I let her speak in silence. Visitors came from across the country. Some wept. Some whispered their own stories to the glass. One woman touched the frame and whispered, "She looks like me." Another said, "I wasn't alone." It was the first time I understood the power of image. Not just for art. Not just for testimony. But for truth. Because that photo proved something no words ever could. I had existed. I had endured. And I was still here. I carry her with me now, that girl in the photo. She walks beside me when I film. She watches when I edit. She's the reason I don't flinch when a former elder stammers during a recorded confession. Because if she could survive what they did, then I can damn well tell the world about it. After the documentary aired, the reaction was explosive. Messages poured in from every direction, strangers, survivors, journalists, even whistleblowers still hiding inside the sect. My inbox became a shrine of pain and revelation. But also of disbelief. Because while the world applauded, while awards came in shiny envelopes and we were invited to speak on glossy panels, the authorities moved slowly. Too slowly. As if they were afraid to touch something this sacred and rotten. The sect had influence. Wealth. Friends in government. Their leaders cloaked themselves in religion and legality, hiding behind charitable works and orphanages. Every attempt to push for a full investigation was met with procedural delays, jurisdictional tangles, or worse, intimidation. Our testimonies weren't enough. One survivor, Zara, bravely filed a criminal complaint. She had dates. Names. Evidence. But when the case reached court, the judge called her memories, emotionally compelling, but unreliable. The defense painted her as unstable. A bitter woman with an axe to grind. I sat in the back of the courtroom and watched Zara break down on the stand. It was the second time she had been violated, this time by a system meant to protect her. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rage kept me awake, but beneath it was something worse, futility. How could we scream into the void if the void was dressed in robes and gavels? That's when I realized the law wasn't built for us. The law was built for men like them. For systems, not people. It was built to measure certainty, not trauma. To evaluate loss in dollars, not in years stolen from a life. So I changed tactics. If the law wouldn't protect us, would make sure truth haunted them instead. We launched Trial of Silence, a web series. Not a documentary, an act of testimony. Survivors told their story straight to the camera. No edits. No cross-examination. No polite framing. Each episode ended with a simple, chilling sentence. He still walks free. The series went viral. Millions watched. Donations poured in. A public outcry started. The names of abusers began trending on social media. And that changed everything. The sect could no longer pretend. Their sanctuaries were picketed. Their prophet was confronted by protesters in the airport. One by one, silent insiders began to speak, not out of conscience, but out of fear. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were witnesses. We were pressure. We were dangerous. And finally, the justice system had no choice but to catch up. Not because it wanted to, but because we refused to be quiet. Just like they taught us. I once believed redemption was a quiet thing. A whispered apology. A secret healing. But I know better now. Redemption is loud. It is earned. It is built brick by brick, day by painful day. After the Trial of Silence series shook the internet, something shifted. A prosecutor with a daughter close to my age took interest. A reinvestigation was launched, not because of the original files, but because of the pressure, the witnesses, and the fury of public demand. This time, our stories weren't treated as anecdotes. They were treated as evidence. Raids were conducted. Arrests were made. Some of the same elders who once made me scrub temple floors until my knuckles bled were now led away in handcuffs. One by one, they appeared in court, no longer draped in robes, but in shame. The prophet, our tormentor, was finally brought in. He looked smaller than I remembered. Frilier. But his eyes were still cold. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt clarity. I testified on the third day of the trial. I wore the same color scarf my mother had forced me to wear the day I was first initiated, only now, I wore it on my terms. My voice didn't shake. I spoke for every girl who couldn't. For those who died. For those who never escaped. For my younger self. When I stepped down, the courtroom was silent. And then Zara stood up. And then Miriam. And then the others. That moment, that was redemption. Not the gavel. Not the sentence. Not the media headlines that followed. But that moment of standing together. Of surviving. Of being believed. The prophet was sentenced to 30 years. Others received less. Some fled. Justice was imperfect, but it was something. As for me, I kept making films. But I also opened something new. A foundation, in memory of a girl who used to sweep temple steps while men preached about obedience. I called it, Hearing Her. We train girls from religiously marginalized communities in journalism, video, and advocacy. We don't just document stories now, we create storytellers. And sometimes, when the sun hits just right in the old stone courtyard where we train, I close my eyes and imagine the child I once was, mute, frightened, waiting for someone to come. I whisper to her, "You came. You came back for me. And now, we are never alone again."